Today in our ongoing discussion of games, I want to look at one of the more under-discussed topics. Soundtracks. Most of the time, if a soundtrack's good, it's a dot point at the end of a review or an attribution to excellent taste. But what about soundtracks which really push the game above and beyond an aesthetic choice? Look at Far Cry 5, a game which has a really interesting and stylistically correct soundtrack. While this soundtrack's good, I found myself turning it off because not only did the game's atmosphere jump with it off, I feel that a lot of the game's cutscenes and monologues were designed to have it off as well.
I just call it home.
Lived here my whole life. Still amazed at how beautiful it is.
Maybe that's what blinded us to how ugly the people were getting. Good day to you, brother.
You don't understand. No one took these groups seriously.
They were different. Religious. Militant. It was a goddamn cult.
I want to talk about 3 soundtracks which do the exact opposite of Far Cry 5. They complement the gameplay, and having them off makes the gameplay worse in my opinion. Hopefully, after looking at all 3, I want to ask a question which I'm not sure I know the answer to. Which one of these soundtracks was more impressive? The 3 soundtracks in question are Friday the 13th the game, Nier Automata, and Doom. These aren't the only games to do creative things with the soundtracks, but are 3 which I think really stick out to me as something which could encapsulate the real leap in technology this current generation of video games has had. This generation of games, to me especially, are pretty interesting examples of games elevating their audio production quality. Let's begin with Friday the 13th. Friday the 13th soundtrack is impressive because it was written by someone who understands the absolute of what Jason and the Friday the 13th series is, Harry Manfredini. Harry Manfredini was involved in the project and shows his mastery as a composer. However, the reason it's impressive is because Manfredini's score syncs up perfectly with the moment-to-moment gameplay based on how frequently it changes. Every 30 seconds or so, the music changes to something almost completely different. Because the gameplay of Friday is very brief, and there's only a small window between being alive and being dead in the game, the soundtrack's short bursts mean that it's likely that when the action starts, an appropriate stab will likely sync up. Let's take my favourite track in the game, Counselor Pursuit. Let's do a quick visual representation here. Every time the track changes, I'll change the colour of the screen. So as you can see at the start and end of the track varies widely. So the reason this is impressive is because the soundtrack is composed to fit around what's happening in the game. What's really interesting about Friday is that as the soundtrack goes on, the intensity of the track also goes up. This complements the gameplay as the counselor is likely to have less of a chance escaping if the track has been playing continuously. This is because the counselor will run out of expendable items or be low on stamina. Jason's rage meter would have also built at this point, which means he's easily able to get into buildings. So if the counselor does make a getaway or is killed by Jason in the climax of the song, it suits it really well. Now, I don't know if this was Manfredini's intention. I think watching interviews, he doesn't give a shit about Xboxes or video games or any of that crap. I think this may have to do with selection bias.
Selection bias helps a lot too. We fall prey to this when we reject all the times the animation doesn't really sync up, focusing instead on the more surprising times when it does.
If so, it's a really practical use of that trick. So let's call this the artistic approach. The soundtrack's composition complements the gameplay. Next, let's look at Yoko Taro's Nier Automata. If you're put off by the game's look and style of being an anime game, I would not blame you, but I really think you owe it to yourself to play this game, especially knowing as little as possible going through it. Okay, so spoilers. Skip here to avoid, you know the drill by now. For the purposes of this video, let's look at the second playthrough of the game when you play as 9S. 9S has a different gameplay style to 2B. Instead of sword slashing, as 2B, 9S hacks enemies. And when you do, the score changes to suit the theme of the action. In the game, this also extends to the intensity of combat. Let's look at one of my favourite levels, the Carnival. When walking around the alleyways, the soundtrack takes a back seat to almost feel like a concert that's happening out of sight. You know, when you hear music, but you're not actually in the same vicinity of it. And then when the action kicks up, so do the vocals. This is how I think they're doing it, however I'm not sure. There are 4 tracks playing concurrently, and when it's time to change to the other track, the game crossfades between the two. I say this as a perhaps because this could also be that they're doing this with the individual tracks for each instrument. Let's call this method the layered approach. The layers of the music changes to suit the gameplay. So this is impressive because it really makes the mood of the gameplay match the action, which means that the slower moments feel slow, but when the action ramps up, so does the music.
They are rage, brutal, without mercy. But you will be worse. Rip and tear until it is done.
Finally, we have the granddaddy of first-person shooters and the new granddaddy of soundtrack development. Doom's development hell went through multiple iterations, but upon release, it quickly became one of the most memorable soundtracks in recent memory. Doom's soundtrack is a technical marvel. Seriously, I think this is something which a lot of games are probably going to try and implement once someone creates a library which easily implements this into, Unity and Unreal. Doom's soundtrack is procedurally generated to have the action match up to the soundtrack, or rather the other way around.
notice that every time I used my machine gun a lot, every time you fire your machine gun, it like starts up the rock music just a little bit. Does it?
If you haven't already, I'd recommend you watch a video by Racevic, which talks about this in the nitty-gritty detail much better than I can. I'd also recommend you watch the behind the scenes with Mad Dog Mick Gordon, because he talks about some of the more interesting nuances and choices, which made the soundtrack even more thematically incredible.
So the idea here wasn't to use the analog equipment as an effects processor, even though that's kind of what it's made for. Basically, I'm using the circuits of the equipment to corrupt the pure sine waves and noise. Electricity is a real, tangible thing. You've got electrons bouncing around on a circuit, and when you capture that, you're capturing a real energy.
So that's really impressive on a technical and artistic level, but does this detract from the artistic merit, knowing the computer's creating the music to perfectly sync up with what you're doing? I don't know. That really, I guess, depends on if you consider every aspect of games to be art, or just the artsy bits that, you know, are good for making gesturing content. Let's call this method the procedural approach. The soundtrack is created procedurally to complement the gameplay. Now this is where my conundrum comes in. All of these soundtracks are impressive for different reasons. Friday the 13th is composed around the intensity of the gameplay artistically, but doesn't really try on a technical level to synchronize it. Nier Automata has multiple soundtracks playing at once and fades them in and out to create a dynamic feeling, based on where you are and what you're doing. But does this mean the game's more predictable because you can tell when it's going to crank it up? Doom's soundtrack is created on the fly to mathematically make it a precise experience, which makes it a really impressive technical feat, but does that make it a bit more of a science than an art? Or does that make it even more impressive because the computer can actually predict what's going to happen next over human ability? I don't mean to say the artistic merit of Gordon isn't there, it absolutely is. So, which one of these is more impressive? That's the question I keep asking myself. Perhaps you can help me out on this. I've set up a Discord to discuss questions like this, which I've linked in the description. Now, I know what you're thinking. Great, another memey Discord with a million channels with no one in it, and you know, then you're at work, you check your phone and someone's posted anime titty. Nope! This is a text-only Discord with one channel, discussion. And that's all it aims to be. I don't see this as a replacement for the comment section, but rather a place to go and talk about this stuff in a little bit more depth after the video's done. Finally, I'd like to let you know that I've made a Patreon with goals based around this kind of content. It doesn't offer much, but if you'd like to pitch in and help with the production of these videos, I'm currently aiming for $50 a month to cover the bill of my editing software. I'm already halfway there, so your generosity is much appreciated. Oh, and just finally, I'd also like to give a shout out to my boy Cannonbreed. He's another game developer from Melbourne, and he drew the 2B art for this video. You should go check him out because he's involved in a couple of games now, one being Death's Gambit, which I'm sure you're probably aware of. He's also involved in Rivals of Aether. He was also part of the team who created No Mario Sky, which turned out to be a better game than No Man's Sky. I really recommend you go check him out. He's a really nice guy, and his art is, you know, it's pretty nice and clean and good.